Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about a library called Tkinter or Tkinter. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. This library allows us to build programs that have what are known as widgets, which include buttons, text boxes, menus, all that sort of thing that you're used to. So to start out, we're going to import, actually we're going to do a from tkinter import star. And once we have this, we can say window equals tk, and we're always going to finish our program with main loop. This will simply create a window. And I got to drag the window to my other screen. So here is a window. You can resize it and all that, but there's nothing in it yet. Once we close the window, the program finishes. So let's put something in the window. There's a variety of things that you can use. They're called widgets. We're going to start with a label. This is like just a little message box. Make a variable, and there's a class called label. So we're going to call its init function. You remember from the last assignment, classes have a init function, and this is where we're calling the label's init function. The first thing that you want to provide to all these different kind of widgets is what's known as the parent object. So if this label is going to be inside that window, then we're going to provide window as the parent. And in the future, we're going to have widgets inside widgets, so the parent won't necessarily be the main window. Next, you probably want to specify what the label is going to say, so we can do something like that. Now, if that's all we do, you won't see it, even though we did make a label and we told it its parent is the window. It's not actually visible yet. What you always need to do with widgets is also run pack. Pack says figure out where you're supposed to be and draw yourself there. So once we've run pack, we'll see the widget show up. Let me drag it back over again. So pack actually makes the window just large enough to contain all the stuff inside of it. So you see it's actually quite a small window now because the font size is really small, and the pack reduced the window to just large enough to contain the label. And if we resize, you'll see it's actually centered and at the top, and you can adjust all that stuff. Of course, you can adjust the font and all that too, and colors and everything. But there's a label. So again, labels are just for showing text. They don't really do anything. You can't really click them or anything like that. They just show a message. We can also make a button, put it in the window, and buttons can have words on them. And then of course you want to pack. Drag it over. So now you've got a label and a button. You can see the button. It should look clickable. You can kind of see a border on it. So there's label followed by a button. And you see that when we did pack, since we did the button pack second, it appears after the label. And we can make a check button. This is a button that has a checkbox on it. Check button. Also put it in the window. Give it a message and run pack. There it is. You can see check it on and off. I don't know why the button's not appearing like I'm clicking it. Might have to do with the fact I'm doing a screen recording with two screens. But you see the check button is functional. And again, everything's centered by default. And we can do an input box, which is called an entry. They don't usually have text. The whole point of one of these is that you're going to type your own text. And we pack. Now, by the way, these don't have to be called exactly button or anything like that. It could be my data or whatever. right? What you call your variables is up to you. But I'll just be simple here and just call it entry. So here's an entry box, and a button, or check button, and a button, and a label. So these are very common widgets that you're going to find on a lot of applications, and now you can make your own. Now, Pack actually supports a few options. You can say the side. Let's pack the label at the top, the button on the left, check button on the right, and the entry on the bottom. I think those are all correct words. Okay, and so you'll see as I drag this over. Actually, so I did label on top, because I did button on the left, everything got associated to the right of that button because the button's on the left. And so that made the entry not necessarily on the, or it made the entry on the bottom, I suppose, but it looks like it's in the middle because these are on the left and the right. So probably more common is going to do like a top and then maybe multiple things on the left and one thing on the right. I don't know. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. So now it looks like the button and the check button are on the left and then the entries on the right. So this would be the same thing as just doing left 3 times because these are all on the left. Next, we have the option of a grid. So I'm going to make a different program here. I'm going to call it TK Grid. Make another window. You don't have to call it window, of course, but why not? Always run main loop at the end. If you don't run main loop, nothing will show up. Now let's say we have a label at the top, and then we're going to put a grid of buttons below it. And we'll just put a bunch of text up here so it's pretty clear what the grid is doing. So this will be really wide. And we're going to pack it at the top. So the button grid will be below. Now, to make a button grid, you don't really want to mix up the label and the grid. It can get complicated. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the label at the top, and then below the label will just be this large container, like a whole nother window, but it's inside this window. And when you do that, you have a frame. So you can put frames inside frames. They're just kind of invisible boxes that collect widgets. So the frame is inside the window, and the frame gets packed as well. It'll be below the label. Now let's run a loop because we want to make a bunch of buttons. I don't want to make them by hand because I'll want like 100 of them, and that's just, it'd be too much code to do it by hand. So I'm going to do a loop 10, and then for every one of those, I will be like the row. We'll do a J for another 10. So that'd be 10 times 10 times, which is 100 times. We're going to make a button, and it goes in the frame instead of the window, and it's text. I'll just want to know which row and column it is, so I'll do the label on the button will be number. It'll be IJ. And now instead of pack, you say grid. So you really have a choice between pack and grid sometimes. And we're going to do grid this time because we want to decide which row and column, because a grid is rows and columns like a table. And we're going to say row is I and column is J. And once you've got that, actually that should be sufficient. So let's see what happens here. All right, so there's our long label. I just wanted to put in some space. And here are all of our buttons. Now they're all kind of tight, so we can fix some of that. Let's put some more X's so there's clearly more space. Let's see what happens then. Yeah, so this time the buttons are centered. And see how they only take enough space just to fit their numbers. So first thing I'm going to do is put some padding, which means it puts a little extra space around the numbers so the button's a little larger, easier to click. That happens here. When you say it's in the grid, you can say pad X is 2 pixels, pad Y is 2 pixels. So they're slightly larger buttons this time. So they're a little bit bigger. Actually, so it's not the button itself, it's the space around the button. Inside, there's a second option. Pull up that documentation. Drag this over. So this website, by the way, is a book about this library, and it's got a lot of good options here. So you probably just want to go to the index and look at all the different options for these things. So I'm looking at, for example, the pack option right now. And the grid options. Grid says that you can do pad X, pad Y. You can also do internal padding. So let's see what that does. I think that'll be the padding inside the button. So we'll have space around the button and space inside the button. Okay, that worked. So here we go. So there's a little extra space inside the button. Now the second thing you can do is you can force these things to grow to the space so there's no gaps on the left and right. So if I put even more X's, you'll see there's even more gap since the label's so wide. And you might not want something like that. So to make that kind of space go away, you can come back to this. First you can say fill both. So first you need the frame itself to maximize the space. It needs to stretch all the way out. If the frame doesn't stretch, it doesn't matter what you do here, the buttons won't stretch either because they're stuck confined in the frame. So first you have to stretch the frame out. And now, since the frame has been fully stretched, the grid just puts itself on the left side. And the frame really goes to the full length here. Next, we need to make sure the buttons themselves stretch out. So to do that, you have to tell the grid that you want to configure the row in the frame, row I, to be weight 1, which means all rows will have the same weight, so they'll all get stretched. And we'll also do column configure for column J. And now everybody's been stretched out to take up the full space. So, actually, not exactly quite yet. The last thing we see, the buttons themselves don't actually stretch out, but they distribute fully the full width, but the buttons themselves are still small. And so the last thing you need to do to get that full effect is add another option. When you put it in the grid, there's a sticky option. Sticky takes directions like north, south, east, west. So you can say stick to the left side, stick to the top, stick to the bottom. Or if you put them all together, like you add them all up like this, it means stretch yourself out to the full space available to you. And finally, we have a version now where the buttons have stretched themselves as much as possible. And even if we resize, now the frame is not stretching vertically, but the frame is stretching horizontally, so you see it's adapting to that. So again, with the grid, you put something in a row and column. You can do the internal padding, which is the space in the button itself before the numbers. You can do external padding, which is the space between the buttons. And then you can tell it to stretch the button to take all the available space. And then these two options tell the grid that it should distribute evenly left and right, or left and right and top and down. And these actually could be done in a separate loop just for I range 10. Since there's 10 rows and 10 columns, you can just say I both times. For row 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and for column 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, it's the same. Oops, that should be weight. The same weight. All right, so here's the full example. So here's a grid that fully stretches out completely with a bunch of buttons inside. The homework will be like this. I'll make a second video for it, but you're going to mix in some different elements, some different widgets. You're going to have a label, you're going to have entry box, you're going to have a button, and so forth. And again, the documentation that you'll want to know about is this book. And so let me just show you what's in the book. If you go to the main book page and you go to the index, the class is a good reference for all the different things that you can support. Here's a button. Here's the basic usage of the button. And the next homework after this one, we'll talk about how to actually do something when the button is clicked. But for right now, we're just talking about how to build the layout. And what you might want to know about are the options for like color, background color, and fonts and things. So you can provide those options when you create the button. See how the options is the second thing here. This first thing is your parent, like window. And the second thing is the options. So you can mix in whatever you want. You can make an icon, you can give it the text, and so forth. Different backgrounds and foregrounds for active or inactive buttons, the width of the border, and so forth. And then like an entry, it's going to be similar. Options is the second thing you provide when you make an entry, and your options are, again, colors, fonts, and justify if you want to be centered when people type in it, and the width of it. And there's labels, and text is, I think, supports fonts inside the text. Yeah, I think it's more advanced than we really need. And that's probably enough. And then the second thing you want to know about is how to use grid and how to use pack. So you see with pack, which is the simple version, you can say things like fill both, so it's expand in both directions. You can put some padding when you put in a widget in a frame, and you can say the side is top, left, bottom, or right. And then with grids, you can make complex grids like this one, or you can do the simple one like we did, which is rows and columns, and padding, internal and external padding, and the sticky. Okay, so pretty much everything you need to know is on this book if you go to the index here. All right, so I'll make a second video specifically about the homework that you're going to be asked to do, and that will also be about layout with Tkinter.